If tomorrow morning, immediately after breakfast, suddenly there was an earthquake, and a silvery light shone in the sky, and the leaves dropped from the trees, and I dashed outside, and there, towering over us like 100 Everests, was this giant figure with lightning playing around his Michelangeloid face, and he pointed down and saying, "Be assured, Keith M. Parsons, that I do in fact exist, and I'm sick of your logic chopping." Dr. Craig, I would join you in the pew of the church, in the front pew of the church the next Sunday.
Be going to the question and answer period. We're going to go to the question and answer period, so be going to the microphone as we wind this down.
You don't think that you would have said, "Boy, I was having a hallucination."
Here's a fascinating debate between atheist philosopher Keith Parson and William Lane Craig on the resurrection of Christ. William Lane Craig presents his case that hallucination theory doesn't make much sense in light of the disciples' demeanor and faithful testimony. He appeals the resurrection as the only reasonable answer to Jesus appearing to his disciples after 3 days.
You do admit these early disciples had some kind of dramatic transformative experience that led them to believe now that their master was alive again, that he was not dead, that he was risen from the dead. And I'm sure you'd admit again too, this is an extraordinary belief that's very un-Jewish. It's very odd, and so we want to know, one of the points that I'm making is we want to know what's the origin of these men coming up with this belief, which they believe so strongly and so sincerely that they were willing to go to these hideous deaths for it.
Why do you believe that it could not have been a hallucination? Surely you know from the things I've said and from the extant literature on the nature of hallucinations, which I assume you've investigated, that hallucinations, as I've said repeatedly this evening, are often experienced by people as being extremely real. Furthermore, as I said in one of my rebuttals, precisely the conditions under which we expect people to have hallucinations are those which undoubtedly were being experienced by the disciples. Yeah. An extreme sense of alienation, an extreme sense of loss, a terrible reactive depression. It's been pointed out many times that, gosh, 1/3 to over 1/2 of the people who have been bereaved will have a waking hallucination of their loved ones that they have lost.
Yeah, but then they don't conclude that they're risen from the dead as a result of that.
Well, why not?
But they don't. I mean,
remember, of course they don't conclude that they are risen. Well, I'm not sure. We'd have to check and see. There are many people that do believe that people are risen from the dead. Once again, in the present day and age, there are people that have encountered the risen Elvis, as I say over and over again.
Yeah, but don't you now in the Elvis case?
And so there are many people, but we have to remember the specific context in which the disciples were existing.
Exactly, and that's why it's misleading to use these Elvis sorts of analogies. You need to show the parallels here.
But the day and age of the disciples was very much like ours in the sense that there was tremendous apocalyptic or eschatological expectation.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, some people even believe that John the Baptist was the expected Messiah. This is why the Gospels are at such pains to indicate, the submission of John the Baptist to Jesus. So there was tremendous apocalyptic expectation. Right. The final age was at hand. God would intervene decisively in history to overthrow the Roman overlords.
Right.
This sort of thing.
They were hoping for a political Messiah who would throw off Rome.
Expectation, why, once again, would it be beyond the bounds of belief to think that the disciples could have an experience of
the end of the world had to occur first before the resurrection of the dead would occur, and it was always a general resurrection. Everybody would come out of the graves, together. And so if they had a hallucination, and let me concede that people who are bereaved and experiencing mourning and loss might have, say, hallucinations of the dead one. Maybe Mary Magdalene or somebody, say, hallucinated Jesus. Given hallucinations as projections of the mind don't contain anything that's not already in the mind. They are projections of the contents of the mind. So given their Jewish expectations and frame of mind, if they were to hallucinate Jesus, they would see visions of Jesus in glory in Abraham's bosom, where the righteous dead went to depart to be with God. And at most, that would have led to the belief that Jesus had been assumed into heaven. He had been translated into heaven, which is a totally different category in Jewish thinking from resurrection from the dead. So I don't think that even if I concede that they hallucinated, which I'm not ready to concede, but even if they did, I don't think it would lead to this proclamation, he is risen from the dead.
Couldn't there have been a process? Couldn't there have been an initial experience of a hallucination, an extremely real seeming experience in which, several apostles, had a hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucination, which once again, psychologists tell us is extremely real as I'm seeing you guys right now, they say. And when they had that experience, and then couldn't there have been a period of time in which, as Shelby Spong says, They thought this over. They reflected on this experience of the resurrected Jesus or the resuscitated Jesus, whatever that they had experienced in the hallucination. They reflected on this. They thought about this. They worked it out in the smithy of their souls, as Spong says. And eventually, the best sense they could make of it is that Jesus was risen from the dead, and that the new age, the apocalyptic age, which Jesus did preach, as far as we can tell, going by the earliest Markan accounts, Jesus did have apocalyptic content. The era was rife with apocalyptic content. Why then couldn't they see his resurrection as the first, prefiguring the general resurrection? Once again, Dr. Craig, I simply did not see such a massive conceptual shift here that we couldn't have something like a paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts do occur.
Yeah, and it's a cumulative case. I mean, what I'm offering here are three independent pieces of evidence which I think cumulatively have force. And with respect to the paradigm shift, it just seems to me that given the Jewish frame of thought and beliefs about the afterlife, that if they were to hallucinate Jesus, the best explanation of what a Jew would believe in having such an experience would not be he is risen from the dead. That was an un-Jewish way of thinking. It's in hindsight that we look back and say, oh, they might have believed that. But that's not the way I think a first century Jew would have interpreted it. I mean, it would have involved spiritualizing the kingdom of God rather than thinking of it as, physically coming. And as I said, I'm not prepared to grant that these were hallucinations, because you can't show any hallucination that fits the model of the resurrection appearances in all respects. And you might pick one hallucination that fits one aspect. Here's another hallucination that fits another aspect. But there isn't anything that fits all of these in terms of the diversity, the range of people involved, and so forth. I mean, for example, James, Jesus' younger brother, we have good reason to believe he was not a believer in Jesus during his lifetime. And yet we know also, we have good testimony that he was a firm believer and leader of the New Testament church afterwards. Now, how do you explain the fact of James' conversion from being an unbeliever to being prepared to die? And he did die. Josephus tells us James died for his belief that his older brother was the Lord. Now, what would cause you or me to believe your brother is the Lord? Apart from what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, then he appeared to James. And you can't write that off as hallucinatory, because James was an unbeliever. And similarly, Paul, was an unbeliever. So it's this diversity that I think makes the hallucination hypothesis less credible.
Can we come to some claims? You had talked about the idea of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yes, indeed.
The question I've got is, what would that extraordinary evidence be in the first century? You didn't have video cameras, you didn't have scientific tests, so what would that look like if you were looking for extraordinary evidence?
That makes it especially difficult, of course, right? It makes it especially difficult in justifying any miraculous claims from those days. And I think that's not a problem for me in any sense at all. That's a problem for the people who are claiming the miracles. The paucity of evidence, if there had been a video camera there at the door of the tomb, and we could see the angel coming down, rolling inside the big stone, that sort of thing. I would say probably, first of all, it was made in the Walt Disney studio. That would be my first hypothesis. That Steven Spielberg had something to do with it. Gospel of Matthew is incredibly Spielbergian. You ought to make a movie of it, okay. But, that would be my first hypothesis. But, you raise a legitimate issue, but, I'd simply have to point out that's not a problem for me. That's a problem for anybody that wants to claim a miracle. T.H. Huxley, in a marvelous classic essay written in 1890-something, he said, look, there are all sorts of sources that we have from ancient times that include eyewitnesses saying, I was there when Charlemagne cured the leper, okay? If we believed all those stories, we would be incredibly credulous people. Remember that wonderful thing in Shakespeare? I love the quote from Shakespeare, from Macbeth. Remember the thing in Shakespeare in Julius Caesar, in which he's talking about, that against the Capitol I saw a lion walking, and I saw a common slave, you know him well by sight, that he was emanating fire, this sort of thing. Well, again, these sorts of stories came from sober, secular, pagan, whatever historians of ancient times. If we believed all of those stories, once again, I've got some Dr. Parsons' patent miracle cure that I would like to save you. I just need to go out and bottle it up, for a few minutes and bring it back into you, and I would like to sell you that. We would be incredibly credulous to believe all this.
Well, these cases have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. You can't dismiss the resurrection narratives on the basis that some other spurious miracle stories have occurred. You have to assess each one on its own merits. And what I fear from your response is that this watchword, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, is really just an excuse for an a priori rejection of the miraculous, because you didn't give any sort of evidence that would satisfy you with respect to one of these extraordinary claims. It made it sound like, to me, you were saying that nothing would convince you, no matter what.
No, all sorts of things would convince me.
Well, with respect to the resurrection, though, I mean, you said if there was a video camera, you'd say it was a fake stone that was rolled away. You know, I mean, what sort of...
That would be the more reasonable hypothesis under the circumstances.
Well, but see, that's what I fear. It is. It's just an a priori rejection of the miraculous here. You're not. There isn't any kind of literary testimony, historical testimony that could convince you.
Once again, it's common sense. Let me appeal to court cases, okay? In court, on what basis do we believe certain testimony, okay? Well, we believe testimony often on the basis of how likely or unlikely we think it is that somebody is telling the truth, on the basis of all sorts of surrounding circumstances. Now, in court case, generally speaking, there are no claims to supernatural action. There are no claims to anything occurring which was physically impossible or against the laws of nature, however one wants to phrase it, that sort of thing. Yet we still judge guilt or innocence, send people to the to execution or not, on the basis of what we consider to be likely or unlikely on the given circumstances, that sort of thing. So once again, these extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In no way implies a bias against the supernatural. It's simply an application of a rule which we use in our daily lives.
But you're saying that when you say extraordinary, really what you're saying is no amount of evidence would convince me of these extraordinary claims.
Sure it would. If tomorrow morning, immediately after breakfast, suddenly there was an earthquake, and a silvery light shone in the sky, and the leaves dropped from the trees, and I dashed outside, and there, towering over us like 100 Everests, was this giant figure with lightning playing around his Michelangeloid face, and he pointed down and saying, "Be assured, Keith M. Parsons, that I do in fact exist, and I'm sick of your logic chopping." Dr. Craig, I would join you in the pew of the church, in the front pew of the church the next Sunday.
Be going to the question and answer period. We're going to go to the question and answer period, so be going to the microphone as we wind this down.
You don't think that you would have said, "Boy, I was having a hallucination."
Remember the conversation between the rich man and Abraham. In the final statement of the rich man's request to send a dead man to warn the brothers, Abraham replied, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead." Truth be told, no amount of evidence will be able to convince a skeptic who has already closed his or her mind to reject the truth. Hence concluding with the words of George MacDonald, "To give truth to him who loves it not is but to give him more plentiful material for misinterpretation."